So Mark wanted to talk about consciousness and using it to solve problems that matter to the agent, and we were going to talk about finding solutions, but also choosing problems. So I'm really interested in that aspect of it, of active agency in terms of choosing the problem you plan to solve, not just looking for solutions in a pre-existing problem space. So those are the topics that we have. So if anybody has thoughts, please.
I'll lead off. I probably said this last time, but I need to be brought up to wherever we were last time. The crowd I run in, or used to run in, would have said about memory, well, every system's got memory. The moon remembers every asteroid impact. DNA is a memory molecule. None of these are memories in the psychological sense. It's a broader understanding of memory. Tell me what this has to do with, what memory has to do with consciousness, because in the world I'm talking about, it's no big deal. Every system has memory.
I would say, if I can start by way of response, I think the way that Mike posed the question was not bound up with consciousness, but I think that is itself an interesting additional question. I think that the question as posed by Mike, or at least as I understood it, is what is the difference between, is there a difference, and if so, what, between memory in the biological meaning of the word, in other words, neural memory, as opposed to the other forms of memory in a broader definition, like, for example, immune function, which involves memory of a sort, and ranging all the way through to what Dan just said. I mean, the moon, any impact upon it leaves a trace. But is that what we mean by memory? So I think that the first question is, the word memory, what does it actually refer to? Does it refer to the impact of the past on the present state of the system, or does it mean something more specific than that? Then Dan's raising an additional question: what is the role of consciousness in memory? So I would say, in terms of the first question, that memory is not just a matter of the trace or impression, influence, effect, etc., of the past upon the present functioning of the system. I think memory, at least the way I understand it, it's learning in the sense that past experience, and I don't necessarily mean conscious experience, but the experience of trying to perform the functions of the system in the past, successes and failures in the past lead to adjustments in how it performs those functions in the future. So for me, memory is about the past, but it's for the future in the sense of updating what I would call the generative model or the predictive model of the system. On the basis of my past experience, what beliefs do I hold as to how the world in which I need to meet my needs works, and so how do I adjust my performance accordingly?
I'll add to that taxonomy. So I could be misremembering here, and I think it was Mike, maybe this was your comment from our last discussion on memory too, as a response to Dan, the kind of notion that you introduced of something to the effect of there's a record or kind of a historicity to something like the moon being impacted with an asteroid. But memory seems, and this is my recollection of what Mike said, it would be a recovery from that. So a return to an original state. So if, Dan, I know the example you've given is what if like bumper is hit in a car and it's dented, that could be construed as memory, but it would actually be returning to the original form that would be a memory of where it had been, that I think was what Mike had introduced as the notion of memory. But correct me if I'm wrong here, Mike. Yeah. And then, yeah, Mark, what you're introducing would be, I think, even a step further in kind of the taxonomy here, where it would be an incorporation of actually learning from past experience. And it reminds me, Dan, of that paper we read in the reading group of the jellies that were running into rods. They did the testing there. So I can't remember what species of jellyfish, but were found to have a really minimal kind of notion of learning or memory in that case, where they would run these poor jellyfish through rods that would hurt them and see if they could actually learn where the rods were and then avoid them in the future. And some of the preliminary research seemed to indicate that they were capable of doing that despite having basically nothing akin to any sort of neural activity whatsoever. So it was a really interesting study that led to think that something like the learning you're talking about, Mark, is capable of really, I don't want to say primitive jellyfish, but pretty minimal systems, minimal cognitive systems.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the critical thing about it is the interpretation end, right? So when you have some sort of physical change take place, the question is who's interpreting it later to recover the meaning of it, if any. So in the case of the moon, what happens is that we as scientists might observe it and therefore have a history of the moon, but the moon itself doesn't use that in any significant way. I mean, one can imagine scenarios in which that would happen, but typically speaking, the interpretation agent in that case is not the system itself. Whereas in other scenarios, it is the system itself that has to continuously reinterpret the memory traces that it has to as Mark just pointed out, to say what does this mean for me going forward into the future. And so I think focusing on and again, I think it's a continuum, because there are all kinds of in between cases of what is who's the recipient of that memory, who does the recall, and that tells us a lot about what we can say about the memory, but also what the utility is of having the concept. So having labeled something as memory, the question now is, does that allow you to bring in all the tools that we have for dealing with memories, right? And to the extent that it does, then it's more or less useful to think of it that way. But that's what I think. And we've also, for the DNA that Dan mentioned, I think it's exactly the same thing. I think morphogenesis interprets information that it has, including DNA, but also cytoskeletal components and everything else. And so I do think it's a memory, specifically in the sense that it's an engram compressed of past experience, but it's up for creative interpretation, as we see embryos do all the time. It isn't a prescription or a plan or anything like that.
Yeah, in light of the last conversation that we had on memory, I started digging into some of the Phil Bio literature on this, and I found the term used all over the place in kind of wildly different contexts, but definitely in the context of DNA, you find it used quite frequently, and it really led me to think that that is actually probably the best baseline understanding of what memory might be, and that actually the cognitive kind of notion of memory that we tend to use as the default is probably just like one little branch offshoot. That's the one that we're preoccupied with. But actually, yeah, Mike, what you're talking about seems to me to have all the important ingredients for really what you need for kind of a robust system that does the memory thing.
In certain cases where the mechanisms are actually conserved, we've given memory blockers to planaria, and if you give memory blockers to a two-headed worm and then cut it, it forgets about the second head and only builds the original head. And if you crank up the dosage and you give it to a one-headed planarian, then what you get is a featureless sphere. It makes this flat. It's not a sphere; it's a disc. It makes a flat circle with no apparent sense of what it should have been in the first place. So it fails to break symmetry and just makes a featureless disc.
So we've got 3 levels of memory here, and no disagreement that I've heard so far. One is the sort of stone tablet kind of memory that DNA represents, that Gunnar was talking about. Then the restorative kind of memory that Mike is talking about, and then the forward-looking kind of memory that Mark is talking about. And you could see them along some continuum. I wouldn't want to identify that axis exactly, but is that a fair summary? I'm not sure I have anywhere to go from there. I'm just making.
Well, I think that's a fair summary. And where we could go from there is to revert to the question of consciousness in relation to all of this. Because in my own way of thinking about consciousness, it actually has everything to do with that trajectory. At the level of memory that I'm talking about, the third of the 3 levels that you've just enumerated, it's a matter of, during the lifetime of the organism, It doesn't have to wait for, what worked and didn't work in terms of the preservation of the species across generations with them learning in that sense, but rather during my own lifetime as a system, I can adjust my behavior in terms of my organismic needs on the basis of past experience, and thereby uh, uh, adapt to the environment that I've. And then where is consciousness required? I think it's precisely where learning fails us. In other words, where you find yourself in a situation for which you do not have any pre-prepared policy because you've not been in that situation before. So the only thing you can do, I mean, not the only thing, but to put it in simple terms, the system then behaves more or less stochastically because there's no basis to the extent that you're genuinely talking about a novel situation. To that extent, there's no basis for acting in one way or another. So I think that stochastic behavior has to have some sort of guide as to is this working or is this not working before it's too late. And you can't wait for the outcome of the random action because then, as I say, it's too late. If it was the wrong action, you're dead. So I think that feeling tells the organism whether this is taking you further away from or closer to this action. Is it taking you further away from or closer to your target state, by which I mean your viable state? So why you feel why consciousness of the action and its consequences is valuable is that it tells the organism how well or badly it's doing in terms of its underlying value system, namely that it's good to survive and bad to die. That goodness and badness is felt as pleasurable or unpleasurable feelings in relation to the particular category of need in question. I think that's the most basic form of consciousness. So to put it differently, consciousness arises in the absence of memory in order to guide voluntary behavior from which we then in turn learn once more from experience and lay down new memories.
So it's early in the conversation, but I want to have a sentence written down here that attempts a synthesis between the two topics of the day. One is picking problems and the other is memory. This, as it comes out of my mouth, this could turn to crap. We'll see. Affect, by which I mean consciousness, Mark, or consciousness by which I mean affect, meaning intentionality, caring, wanting, preferring, all that good stuff, picks out problems. That's how the organism picks out problems. It cares about X, Y, and Z and not about A through W. Yeah. Then when it comes to solving that problem, memory is the input that it has as a guide. I think that was your word, Mark, as a guide to how to go about solving. Otherwise, you're going to have to behave stochastically, and that the odds of that working. So there's an ordering to it. First, you got to pick the problem. That's what consciousness does. Then you've got to solve it, and that's what memory does. Didn't sound as bad as I thought it was going to.
I think that there's 3 steps in what you've just described, not 2. I agree that it starts with the selection of the problem, and I agree that consciousness is involved in that, and I'll come back to that in a second. Then there's the what preparedness do I have from past experience as to how to solve this problem. That's the second step. The third step is, and what do I do beyond that? Where I enter the arena of uncertainty. In other words, where I do not have a pre-programmed solution based on past experience or on my genotype. What do I do then? And consciousness kicks in then again. So consciousness kicks in twice. So to come to step 1, which is the selection of the problem, I think this is a prioritization task. The organism always, or the system, this self-organizing system, always has a variety of problems, but it can't act on all of them simultaneously. There's an action bottleneck, so it's got to prioritize. Which problem am I going to tackle now? And generally speaking, that is determined by how big is the need. In other words, how far am I from my target state? And what are the current opportunities? How great are the chances that I'll be able to satisfy that need? So I think that there's There's a balancing of multiple possible multiple problems that could be tackled in terms of how urgent is the problem and in terms of how great is the opportunity of solving it. And so the outcome of that prioritization process, in my way of thinking, is that you then feel the problem that you've prioritized. The others are relegated to automaticity. In other words, I'm not going to, I'm going to rely exclusively on past knowledge when it comes to the solution of these problems. They're going to run on autopilot. This one, I'm going to navigate. I'm prioritizing this one. I'm giving all my computational power to solving this problem. I'm feeling my way through this problem. And step 2, as I say, is the kicking in of the prior learning. I've already dealt with that. Step 3 then is now it's not just I feel hungry as opposed to I feel fear, as opposed to I feel sleepy. That's the prioritization. The one that you feel is the one that's prioritized. That's the category of affect. Then you're in that category. You're feeling your way through the solution of that problem. How well or badly am I doing in terms of meeting this need? It's tethered to the affect, in other words, the valence of the affect, but it also has to do with a consciousness of the context within which that problem is. In other words, I feel like this about that. So, this thing out there is causing this problem. That thing out there is presenting this opportunity. So that's a different meaning of the word consciousness. It's the feeling of your way through the problem in context, as opposed to the state of the sort of I am now in a state called hunger, as opposed to sleepiness, as opposed to fear, etc.
So in that context, the way that you've laid it out there, I'd be curious with cases like the one that Dan and I have focused on as kind of illustrating what we would see to be an emblematic instance of goal-directedness of a bacterium doing chemotaxis or chemotaxis. So in that case, it goes through, right, it's in this chemical gradient and goes through straight runs and tumbles, and then it reorients and keeps trying to head in a certain direction. So in that kind of a minimal system, do you see this sort of operation unfolding? Would it have something like an affective state?
I must first of all declare my ignorance when it comes to this, and bearing present company in mind. I don't want to reveal my ignorance without declaring it in advance. I don't know that much, but I can.
I just recite what Dan's told me.
So I'll tell you what I think. I think that following a chemical gradient like that, to the extent that there is a pre-programmed action that always, when I come across this particular chemical gradient, this is good, this is bad, so I always do this. To that extent, I don't think that consciousness is involved. To the extent that there's an algorithm that just runs its course. However, because even such a simple organism as you're describing has more than one need, I think that their affect does come into play. In other words, am I currently avoiding a noxious tissue damage stimulus, or am I following an appealing chemical gradient? I think that to the extent that you don't just have one need, to the extent you have categorical needs, both or all of which need to be met in their own right. To that extent, you just are talking about qualitatively differentiated variables. So I think that that's the ground zero for me of qualia, is to the extent that the system must register its needs in terms of qualitatively distinct categories.
Which leads me to ask Mike a question. What fills the role in these restorative systems, let's say, that are just trying to get back to where they were? What fills the role of stating the problem and prioritizing the problem that Mark has assigned to affect to consciousness?
Yeah, great point. Well, two things I think can be said. One is actually just about the previous example. So there's the bacterium, and there's a circuit that actually the way that it knows how to go in the gradient is because of a memory, right? So my understanding is that it's not that it can measure the concentration of the sugar between the front and the back because it's too small. It actually has a memory that tells it of, I think, 20 minutes or something, that tells it how are things improving, basically, right? And then it does this, run and tumble thing. But there's in some bacteria, there's an extra loop on top of that, which is this like metacognitive thing that it doesn't measure the sugar. What it measures is how is my metabolism doing? Because you might be in a field of sugar, but the sugar could be poisoned. And so going with the gradient, your primary directive to go up the gradient might actually be not helping you at all. And so there's another set of loops that looks inward, not outward. It doesn't measure the outside world, it measures your own metabolism. And if the metabolism isn't going well, it will override the primary loop and it will say, go somewhere else. Your basic thing isn't working, right? So even in the bacteria, there are these kind of meta loops. And one of the things that we've seen, and this is not published yet, we're still kind of sorting it out, is, and this will go to partly to Dan's point, is that when we take a cell and we knock in using a heterologous promoter that the cell doesn't have, we knock in some ion channel that depolarizes the cell. Cells don't like it. In fact, Belushka thinks it's the earliest form of pain, right? Is depolarization, which is what neurons are so good at. But that it's this like ancient thing, and so within about 24 hours, the cell turns off that gene that we knocked in. Now, this goes to Mark's point, which is that you have to know what's causing your problem. I feel bad about what, right? So yes, I'm depolarized. This is a real problem. I need to fix it. How does the cell know which thing is causing that problem? We actually don't know. This is because it's a completely new thing that has never existed. It's not one of the cell's normal genes. It comes from the outside. So knowing that particular one out of whatever 20,000 that you might have that could be causing it is distinctly non-trivial. And I think that figuring out, I think this is one of the things biology is very good at, is figuring out what it's a credit assignment. What the computer scientists would call credit assignment is like, here are some things that are going well, here are some things that are going poorly. How much of that can I assign to what, so that I know which knobs I need to twist? And in the morphogenetic systems that Dan was asking about, we often have this scenario where either in the case of completely novel architectures, like things like anthrobots and chimeras and weird things that really can't rely on past fixed behaviors nor fixed interpretations of the genome. Their genome might be perfectly standard. So anthrobots have a standard human genome. Xenobots have a standard frog genome. There's nothing different in that material. It's going to tell you what to do. You need to figure out how you're going to solve the problem. And the problem is very general. It's to, I don't even know how to call it. It's to be a coherent organism in this new environment. So you might solve it by in a number of different morphologies, a number of different behaviors, right? There's different ways to be, especially if you're not one of the standard things that you've evolved, you've evolved to be. So I think there must be, and sometimes we see pieces of this in some of the bioelectrical circuitry of figuring out which of several modes you're going to try to persist as a coherent entity, and I think there's a lot of what otherwise would be called creative problem solving. If any of these things were robots that we had made, you would say that it's intelligent problem solving, that these things are coming up with new ways to first of all, to pick the problems they're going to solve. So am I going to, for example, actually there's a bacterial example of this too. If you're in a sugar gradient, you can do one of two things. You can move up that sugar gradient, so that's an action. You've taken an effector, you've activated an effector in movement space, but you might also transcribe a gene that lets you use a completely different chemical as food. And so physically you haven't moved, but you've taken a step in transcriptional space, and you've solved that problem by moving in a completely different space, right? In the transcriptional space, which leads you to improvement in physiological space. But which of those are you going to do, right? Those are both options for you.
That second move would be an intergenerational move, though. It would be like a move in the lineage or something.
No, I don't mean mutation.
Okay.
It's a transcriptional. So I have multiple enzymes. I have an enzyme for metabolizing lactose, glucose, fructose. I don't know, I'm making all that up, so one thing you can do is if you've been using your metabolism enzymes for glucose, let's say you're moving up that concentration, you might, if that gradient, let's say, is not paying off for whatever reason, you might just upregulate the gene that allows you to metabolize fructose instead. Okay. And just start exploiting a different, and so those might be completely orthogonal gradients. And then once you do that, now you start following a totally different gradient. But ultimately, what you've done is you've taken a move in a space that's normally not visible to us. It's not the, we love movement and behavior that we can see with right, movement in 3D space. But these things they're traversing all kinds of problem spaces that we don't normally see.
So here's a common my attempt again at a common thread amongst all of this, and tell me where it fails. Whether we're talking bacteria or morphogenesis or conscious problem solving, what we've got is first the picking of the problem. This is a conceptual breakdown. It doesn't happen this way in time exactly. We've got the picking of the problem and the prioritizing of problems. We've got memory, which is the input as a guide to solving all of those problems, whichever ones you've picked, but there it is available. And then there's the actual solving of the problem, which is what I would want to call cognition. And it's my first pass at it is to say that it's affect free, it's consciousness free, it's problem prioritizing free, except Mark pointed out there's this back and forth between the problem solving and the problem itself. But at any rate, this breakdown, Mike calls it generalized problem solving, creative problem solving. At any rate, there's the 3 steps here: the picking and prioritizing of problems, the memory to guide in solving them, and then the generalized problem solving, creative problem solving that actually enables you to solve it. And I want to call that cognition.
I'm happy to call it cognition, bearing in mind that we use that word for both conscious and unconscious problem solving. So the conscious bit is the bit where there's the palpating of the uncertainty, and that in turn, as you reminded us, is tethered back to the prioritized need. How well or badly is this problem solving working in relation to the original?
Right, but conceptually, those are separate functions. This tethering is across a gap. One is just value neutral solutions to problems, and the other is the prioritizing and picking of problems. And I agree there's a back and forth, but I want to split this. I want to split cognition off because it's value free. It's problem solving.
I would be very happy to split it off. To put it in very, very simple terms, I think that the affect is the demand for cognitive work, and the cognition is the work so demanded. They're not the same thing.
You need to chime in here, if this made any sense.
Well, I think it made total sense, but I think there's another component that it typically gets left out that I'm super interested in, and I think we know the least about this, which comes in at the very beginning, which is some sort of, and I don't think this is algorithmic, Ben. I don't know what else to how else to characterize it other than creative, in that before any of the other steps, you have to figure out what is the set of possible problems that you could solve, right? And some of those, how do you know all? Basically, if you it's like those IQ tests where they show you, like, here are 4 objects, and you make them stand one on top of each other. And it turns out that the genius solution is actually to not do that at all, but to do something completely different, and to just, misuse all of them in some way that lets you, do something interesting. And we see people doing that. We say, oh, genius problem solving, right? Because you've identified another way to do something interesting that is out of the box. What people say, out of the box, right? So that part of just figuring out what is the set of things that you might take on, that could help you. What are all the problem spaces? So you've got effectors if you're a cell, in physiological space, in transcriptional space, and in physical space, if you can move. But knowing that those are our categories as a scientist looking down on this thing, that's how we cut up the world. But what does the system actually see, and what other spaces are there? And it's important also because I think people often say that organoids in a dish are not embodied. and they say that software agents in a computer are not embodied. And that makes me very nervous because we're not very good at seeing bodies, and we're not very good at seeing navigation of different spaces. And us looking at it from outside, just because the thing isn't rolling around, on wheels or something, it doesn't at all, to me anyway, it doesn't mean that it's not embodied. It could be doing this perception action loop, exactly the kind of thing that Mark was describing, in all kinds of spaces that are not visible for us and maybe don't even make any sense to us, right? We've decided that transcriptional space is different from physiological space. I mean, we did that as observers. So I think that first step of cutting up the world from a very high dimensional space, if you want to track microstates, which I don't think living systems ever do, into some kind of a low dimensional, coarse-grained set of spaces in which you can choose problems, like that step is fundamentally creative. And I think it's fundamental to being a mind in the world, is deciding how you're going to cut it up into spaces to look for problems in.
And you don't think that's just handed to every organism by its biology, roughly speaking? I know it's dynamic, but
Yeah.
No, I would agree with Mike, and I would do so on the basis of this distinction. I think that we're using the word problems in quite a general way here, and I think we need to distinguish between two ways in which we're using the term. The one is organismic needs. They are invariant. So we all have the problem of thermoregulation, of sleep, of pain, of etc. Hydration, blood oxygen, and so on. These needs, we can't choose them. These problems are given by our phenotype. What we're going to do about meeting those needs is another meaning of the word problem. And this is where the creative processes that Mike is talking about enter into the picture. So, there's certain standard procedures. Those are reflexes and instincts. Then there are things I've learned on the basis of my own past experience. In other words, my own individualized solutions to these problems. And then there are new solutions on the hoof. But I think that what many of my cognitive colleagues fail to remember in this connection is that that's true. There's all this cognitive creativity, all of this scope, but ultimately it's tethered to the fact that it's got to meet those stereotype needs. So cognition doesn't exist for its own sake. Cognition exists because the organism has phenotypic needs that must always be met. The cognition for its own sake would be a perversion of cognition. It would be very bad for the organism if it just starts solving problems for their own sake because they exist.
Well, here I wonder.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say that is a really interesting point that I hadn't previously appreciated. I've got one weird example for you for that one, and I think I need to think about this more. When we have a bunch of loose frog embryo epithelial cells, the xenobot into which they assemble does not live longer than the cells themselves. As far as I can tell, it provides no survival advantage to them. As far as, and I don't know if the Maslow hierarchy is really a thing or not. This is, but if you think about this hierarchy of needs, right? The very bottom thing of survival, that morphogenetic process is not helping that at all. I almost envisioned it's some sort of higher level need than that. It's not just about bare bones survival. We can all survive as cells. But what if we do something more interesting than simply survive and sit there as individual cells? What if we assemble together, solve some problems in anatomical space, which are, the morphogenesis, and then maybe we solve some problems in behavioral space because they can move around and, do a couple of interesting things. So I don't know, right? Some of these needs are certainly going to be survival needs, but maybe the need for sociality, the need for interesting experiences, however we're going to quantify that, is also there, beyond bare bones like physiological.
Well, yeah, but both of those, I don't know if you just use those examples at random, but sociality and curiosity are certainly survival. They certainly are strategies that enhance our our survival, our fitness. The existing in a group, there are all kinds of advantages to the survival of the individual member of the group by becoming part of a group, which then the survival of the group enhances your own individual prospects of survival as a member of that group. And likewise, curiosity or for want of a better word, I mean, it's just proactive engagement with uncertainty is always a good thing, because uncertainty bites you in the backside if you don't engage with it. So there's certainly survival advantage in just exploring.
Well, it's interesting that you, and this struck me earlier when you brought up kind of the question of picking amongst competing needs or competing problems. And now with the issue of fitness, because it always strikes me as enhanced fitness, of course, is survival, but it's also quite frequently reproduction, right? And actually what can reproduce oftentimes is the better measure of fitness than survival. And oftentimes those are competing and in conflict with each other, actually more often than not. So as far as picking amongst kind of priorities or different space, like it seems as though right there you already kind of have this elemental way in which something is going to be forced to prioritize which direction it goes in of say, those two really baseline elemental things. Then also, I was curious, Mike, in that, so Mark, you were saying how there is, again, this kind of, insofar as we are embodied biological things, there's these metabolic baseline physiological needs that we all must maintain that are pretty universal. But when you start extending kind of the idea of cognition outside the biological realm into other embodied agents, then it looks like the set of what cares or preferences that sort of a system would have are going to just be entirely on a different dimension if it would have them, that if they aren't rooted or grounded in those sort of baseline physiology that all life would share.
So
two separate thoughts. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Mark, did you want to say anything about the first one?
No, just to say that, of course, you're right to reprimand me for saying survival without adding survival to reproduce. I mean, certainly I agree with you, and survival in the service of reproduction. So reproductive success certainly takes priority. I agree with you. Survival of the species is what we're talking about.
Just to add to that, it now occurs to me that the interesting thing about the Xenobots in this case is that having assembled into this multicellular thing, they have recovered a weird new way of, I'm not going to call it reproduction, but it's replication, because if provided with loose skin cells, they do collect them into new generations of Xenobots, right? So it's like they know they want to do multicellularity, they know they want to replicate, but in a way that has not been reinforced by evolution before. There's never been, as far as we know, there's never been kinematic self-replication in living lineages. So it's some sort of, again, it's this creative, right? We have the urge to make copies of ourselves, can't do it the way that we've been doing it for eons. We don't have any of that equipment, but here's this crazy new way we can actually propagate our pattern forward that has never been seen before. So maybe you're right. Maybe that is some kind of a baseline imperative underlying some of this creative problem solving. But the thing is, so Gunnar, so the thing about these imperatives in non-biological systems. So I'm gonna so I have a crazy opinion on this. That's very different from what I think most people would say, which is that I think most people are pretty comfortable with this idea that biology has internal innate imperatives because of its sort of needs for survival and reproduction and all of those things. And then we have machines, and these machines just have whatever imperatives we give them with our algorithms. We write the algorithm, we contrive the materials, and they have whatever we've given them as imperatives. So I don't think that's right. And they certainly have some of those, and good machines do the things you wanted them to do. But from the research that we've been doing, I think even extremely minimal things are also doing things that are not in the algorithm. You did not tell them to do, and are simple or perhaps more complex versions of the kind of processes that we've been talking about here that do not derive from the maker of that machine. They are intrinsic. Where do they come from? That we can talk about that too. I have some crazy thoughts on that. But I think that distinction. I don't think there are any machines in the old sense of the word. I don't think they exist. I think even the dumbest, simplest things, and our model system for this are these sorting algorithms. So we have this paper showing that even stupid bubble sort, this 6 lines of code that everybody's been working, every computer science student has been studying this thing for decades. Yeah, it sorts numbers, all right, but if you look at it from a different perspective, what you actually can detect are things like delayed gratification and then some other interesting things that are literally nowhere in the algorithm, that they're just not there. And yet something as simple as bubble sort can have these, I call them side quests, while they're sorting the numbers. So they have to sort the numbers just like we have to obey the laws of physics. But consistent with that, there's a whole range of other things that you could do that are not prescribed by the laws of physics. And we're pretty happy that humans and other living things do those things while being consistent with physics. But I think it turns out that even very minimal quote unquote machines or algorithms have some of that as well. And so I think that aspect of it probably goes all the way down, that everybody's to some extent constrained by physics, and everybody to some extent has these novel behavioral propensities that they do to meet new goals that we would have never in a million years known if we hadn't looked, because it isn't in the algorithm any more than our goals are in the biochemistry that underlies us. So I still see, I know it's an old refrain of mine, but I still see a single continuum, and it's just a question of how sophisticated are these side quests that you're able to impose on top of the physics that constrain your body.
Yeah, I've heard you speaking about that before, Mike, and engaged with you on that. And certainly, just as a bare minimum, I have to agree. I mean, as you know, I have to agree that there's no fundamental distinction between biological and non-biological systems in terms of the things we're talking about. I think this philosopher whose name I always forget, Haugeland, I think is his name, who said computers don't give a damn. I would say, well, it depends on what kind of computer you're talking about. But say that again.
No, I was just about to launch, but go ahead, you finish.
Well, I wanted to go on to a slightly different question. So maybe, Dan, you should speak first if it's about the thing we've just been saying.
It is. Mike, do you think that these novel goals that these creatures come up with, and our novel goals for that matter, aren't they all going to be derivative of some basic set that's been handed, some large basic set that's been handed to them? I mean, the bus coming at me and getting out of the way of the bus was never pre-programmed genetically. And my fear of the loud noise being in the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth was never pre-programmed, but it's derivative of things we can point to in our biology.
Yeah. The short answer is no. Well, no. And I think that in our very simple, I mean, that's the reason I go to these extremely simple model systems where there is no new biology, there is no history of evolution. It's just the algorithm, so you can see all the parts, right? There's nothing hidden. And so what I see, I don't think is derivative in the, my definition of derivative would be that an intelligent person looking at the algorithm would say, okay, here's a set of things that could be derivative of this. I don't think they're in that class at all. I think they're completely distinct.
Sure.
But I will say this: I do think they're pre-programmed in one funny way, which is that, and this is getting even weirder. But I now suspect that the agent in all of these cases is not the machine or the body or the embryo or the algorithm that we see. It's the pattern that manifests through it. In other words, I've been toying with this idea of this platonic space of patterns, and I wonder if what we're actually looking at is the agent in this case is the pattern itself. It's not the system. And and these patterns are basically that what we build when we make embryos, xenobots, computed, whatever. What we're building are pointers. We're building pointers into the space of patterns. I think that space might be kind of under positive pressure in a way, that these patterns are the vocabulary fails completely, but they're sort of looking for places to poke through, ingress into the physical world. And if in that sense they are pre-programmed, because there is a space of these things that maybe, what degree of infinity, I don't know, but there's a space of these things, and so to some extent they pre-exist, but I don't think they are in any direct way connected to what we build. It's the same connection as between the structure of a pointer and whatever data structure it points to. There has to be some relationship for it to work, but it's not at all straightforward. And you learn very minimal things looking at the structure of a pointer about what it is that you're going to find when you dereference it. So that's my suspicion at this point.
Cool stuff. You are out there. We could go back and forth for another hour, but let's head down Mark's path.
Yes, that last point that Mike made, we most certainly could go back to that for an hour, if not a year. There's much to be said about that. As Dan says, want to change gear, but it's not dropping. It's not a complete. It picking up on a theme that we were discussing a little earlier. It's the question of what is an affect in relation to a phenotypic need. We were saying, well, you have to prioritize these needs, and then the one that you've prioritized will be the affect that you feel. They are categorical, therefore they are qualitatively distinct. They are my needs, therefore they are subjective, and so on. I say all of these things because I frequently find myself having to persuade colleagues, including computer scientists, that if you're describing a mechanism that has these properties, it is the system's own need in order for it to continue to exist as a system, and it is just a categorical variable, and it's registered only by the system, and it only has value for the system. That just is an affect. I don't care whether it's in a biological system or not. I don't care how simple the organism is. That just is an affect. It has the mechanistic properties of an affect. Now, all of that said, I would like to go a little further, actually a little further in the opposite direction in a manner of speaking, which is that I don't think that an affect is the same thing as each phenotypic parameter. Like Mike was saying earlier, that the bacterium finds itself in a situation where it has this need. Well, it can either act in that way or it can transcribe in this way, and both ways it's done the same thing. I think that once we have relatively complex organisms, there are also multiple physiological parameters which combine to constitute a need. So if you take the affect of hunger, for example, it's not measuring one thing. The things going on in the organism that are ultimately felt as hunger are a really myriad physiological processes. And I'm saying this only because this has been very much on my own mind, and I'd love to hear your guys' take on it. To me, one of the reasons why affects exist as affects, in other words, it's not just a measurement of a physiological variable. It's a measurement of something else. It's a measurement of some kind of average of a number of variables. Those variables could be tweaked in a number of different ways. They'll all still have the same outcome, which is energy supplies are being met, but there are multiple different constituent parts of that. And there's a forward-looking part, there's a present part, there's a this, there's a that. So I think that the reason affects exist as affects, rather than just as a physiological variable, is because they are a higher order kind of summation of the state of the organism in relation to this category, that category, or the other category. And the same could be said, it's not just introceptive, the same could be said extraceptively, and maybe in a way it's easier to say it this way. We all know that there's an affect called fear. That means I'm in danger. But shit, there's a myriad things going on in the world that could constitute a danger, so all of those multiple different things are registered, are averaged or summated or measured in terms of one homeostat called the homeostat for danger. So the affects exist at a level slightly beyond the individual physiological or environmental parameters which constitute them. And why I'm banging on about this is I intuit. My intuition is that somehow that's important for why there is such a thing as the affect, and why the affect has causal consequences itself, above and beyond the physiological parameters that it monitors.
So, Mark, I'm going to go in the same direction you're going, but I'm going to go further.
I'll be right back. I apologize.
Okay,
Okay.
Gunnar.
Okay, sure. Deal with the toddler. I'm going to deny that there's any reality to a desire to survive or to reproduce for a living organism in the moment. There's just no programmed affect that goes with that. What there is programmed affect to eliminate the hunger in my belly, the feeling in my belly. Programmed affect to respond to some attractive mate that wanders by. All very context specific, a slightly different feel. There's no such thing as fear. Evolution never favored fear. Natural selection doesn't care about it. What it favored was a certain kind of reaction to this stimulus, a certain kind of reaction to that one, a certain kind of reaction to that one. We lump them together linguistically and call them all fear. But the affect is what's driving the system in the moment. I don't have any desire to survive and reproduce. This is Darwinian thinking transplanted from an intergenerational story into a proximally caused organism.
I'd
So
love
really,
to hear Mike's view on that, but I must say that it strikes horror in my heart what you've just said, Dan.
well, why is that? Because I'm just taking what you said and I'm making the conceptual separation
Right.
between the evolutionary process and the physiological processes.
Why it strikes horror is because there's a colleague in affective neuroscience who argues what you've just argued and comes and does so on the basis of a whole sort of relativist, social constructivist sort of
Oh
thing. There
God,
are
no.
no natural kinds of affect and so on. So I'm sorry. Yes, when I say it strikes horror irrationally in my heart. I know exactly what you're saying, and I'm very sympathetic with what you're actually saying. But
Yes,
but let me put it in a slightly different words. I really do want to hear what Mike and going to
yes,
think about this. So, but I just want to put it slightly differently. I agree. There is no feeling. There's no imperative at the level of mental states. I must reproduce. I must do my biological duty and reproduce. Or, I must improve my sugar levels. And so therefore I better look for something that's got high glucose content. No, I feel sexual desire and I satisfy I gain that erotic pleasure in ways that has got no chance of leading to reproductive success. And in
exactly.
fact, most of the time when we have sex, even if heterosexual sex, we're trying not to reproduce. So the thing that motivates us is the feeling, not the underlying biological imperative. Likewise with sweet things, we eat them because they taste nice. We don't eat them because they're going to improve our glucose supplies. We don't even know that. I mean, a kid has no idea why it likes sweet things. It just likes them and it eats them because it likes them. So that goes back to my original point. The feeling has causal consequences,
Yes.
and so we are actually saying the same thing. And forgive me for my PTSD at the beginning.
So you directed this at Mike, and I'm going to start his answer for him, and he can tell me where I'm off track. The problem space that the organism brings with it into the world is not survival, reproduction, fear, and so forth. It's way more complicated than that. We can't begin as specialized organisms to know what the bacterium's problem space and how it's chiseled it up is. We can lump these behaviors and these imperatives that it has under the category of reproduction and those under the category, but that may not be how the organism chisels up the world. Its feeling set, all the reproduction related feeling sets in its case may be completely different from ours. And what's required is an empirical project to figure out what they are rather than just saying, well, that's reproduction and that's hunger. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with what you just said, and I think that's right. I think our categories are not necessarily what the system itself sees at all. But I'm also, and I'm not certain about any of these. These are just things I've been playing with recently. I think there's also a version of this where what's actually going on is that there are specific, I don't know what to call them other than patterns of behavior that are they facilitate their own propagation into the physical world, because evolution gains massively from these free lunches that are pulled out of this platonic space, where you don't, you get all kinds of interesting things for free when you make very minimal pointers. But of course, then that guides the system towards elaboration of those same physical bodies that in the end up, whether or not the individual recognizes it or is capable of recognizing it in their own behavior, ends up strengthening those behavioral patterns over a lineage lifetime. So I think I agree with you that there are these two different scales, and there are multiple observers. There is the conscious observer that will tell stories about why did I just do this or that, versus the bigger kind of larger scale story about, well, why was your cognitive architecture such that it facilitated you to do that, right, on the longer scale. But I think there's also a perspective here. There are many perspectives. There's the perspective of the organism. There's the perspective of the lineage, of the organs within the organism, of the scientist observing it, of the parasites trying to hack and take advantage of those various drives. But I also think there's this perspective of the patterns themselves that are actually using using the physical bodies that we are so fixated on in terms of evolution as vehicles to propagate themselves. And I don't mean it in the Dawkins sense that that these things are just kind of mindless replicons. I actually think that's where the cognition might be, but I think it's real. I don't think it's mindless, and I don't think it's mechanical. But I do think that some of it is not embodied in the standard way that we see these things.
The other thing that strikes me with all this too is that even in kind of the fitness enhancing capacities that something like affect would have, there's still so much more space, because I think it's easy to jump from affect playing the role of perfection, but it's always that, in evolution, it's good enough, not perfect. So even though these things can be fitness enhancing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were all selected for those reasons. And in that kind of extra space where selection might not have been the mechanism that's kind of governing how affect developed in some system or other, it seems like there's lots of different possible space where it could kind of go off in other directions. So, and I think something like cognition is just a prime example of that, where it has the capacity to go in lots of different directions. Well, on the whole, it's probably a fitness enhancing capacity. It needn't prove to be in every instance by a long shot. So there's just all these other ways in which it's good enough, and it actually leads in weird, interesting directions in all sorts of other cases. It's figuring out which is I'm very much with you, Dan, and that it's just the realm of biology, and such a fascinating empirical project to try to figure it all out.
I can't go without saying one thing about Mike's most out there comment about the Platonic forms. I must say one thing about it, Mike, which is that I have pondered for quite some time from a dual aspect monist perspective. If we are both brains and minds, and they are the same thing, then the easiest way to explain that is that, well, it's just the same thing looked at from different perspectives. My experience is just the being of the brain. It's the subjective perspective upon this thing. If I looked at it as an object, I would see a thing. If I look at it as a subject, then I experience a state of mind. So that always seemed to me a fairly straightforward way of thinking about the mind-body relation, that they are in fact perspectives upon the same ontological entity, which then raises the question, well, then what is that entity? If these are just two representations or two perspectives upon it, then ontologically, what is that entity? What is it consisting? If it's not physiology and anatomy, and it's not conscious mental states, what is it? And I think that the answer to that is something similar to what you're talking about. When you say that there's an organizational pattern, there's a functional system which manifests in one or another form, but the actual fundamental underlying entity is not the realization in its form. Especially easy to see when we're talking about an entity which realizes in two different forms simultaneously, as in the mind-body relation.
I'm
You
very
don't look
sympathetic
happy.
to
I
that
thought you'd look
position.
happy. You'd say, okay, Mark, my idea is not completely untethered to your idea, but maybe it is.
Oh, it makes sense to me.